Depending where you are, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. In this era of COVID-19 virtual events, where we cover multiple time zones with these virtual events, it seems like Australians were present with their general greeting, good day. So we're delighted to welcome you to this joint Perth USAsia Centre, University of Western Australia Public Policy Institute online panel discussion on what have we learned from COVID-19's impact on Australia, India, and Indonesia. My name is Gordon Flake. I'm the CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre. And before we proceed any further, allow me to acknowledge that it is the tradition of the Perth USAsia Centre, as well as the University of Western Australia, to pay our respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, even if it is only virtually. We recognize and acknowledge the elders of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation and pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. The Perth USAsia Centre is greatly honored today to jointly host today's panel along with the University of Western Australia's Public Policy Institute. Not only am I honored to serve on the advisory board of that institution, but we're doubly fortunate to have the chair of the PPI, the Public Policy Institute, also serve as a distinguished fellow at the Perth USAsia Centre and sit on our board, and that is none other than former Foreign Minister and former Defence Minister, Professor Stephen Smith. I am also very much looking forward to a discussion from some distinguished panelists from throughout the region, and their political leaders, I might dare say friends as well, particularly from these two countries that have come to define the Indo-Pacific, that is Indonesia and India, and they have been the primary focus of the Perth USAsia since our initial launch just 7 years ago. At this time, I'm going to hand over the moderation to my colleague and partner in this endeavor, Professor Shamit Sagar, who is the inaugural director of the University of Western Australia's Public Policy Institute. So without further ado, Shamit, over to you to introduce our panel and more importantly, the moderator of today's event.
Gordon, thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to all those who are tuned in to this Zoom webinar. It's my pleasure to also welcome you to this event. And it is really goes to the heart of one of the great public policy challenges of our time, to both be able to comment with a distinguished group of people this afternoon upon the nature of the crisis in individual countries, but also internationally, and at the same time say a little bit about what countries have in common and where those commonalities cease. We have a first order public health international crisis on our hands, but it feels, and the experience of it is very different from one country to the next. And I hope in the course of this afternoon we'll be able to also shed light on the nature of those differences and how they have come about. I'm delighted also to welcome Stephen Smith, who I'll be handing over to in a moment. Stephen is a former senior politician here in Australia, known very well across the region as well as globally. He chairs our advisory board, and in doing so brings with that the illustrious panel who will be commenting upon this issue this afternoon. Before we dive into that, can I just make sort of a very quick remark around what COVID-19 seems to be in terms of the challenges for public policy itself. The esteemed American commentator Francis Fukuyama, some of you may have realized recently, has commented upon the nature of the crisis and made a very simple observation that there are three things that are going on. It is really a combination of the extent to which states have capacity to deal with this unprecedented crisis outside of wartime. Second of all, the extent to which states are characterized by societal trust. Do people trust one another, never mind their leaders? And lastly, the caliber and the skills of leadership. These three factors, capacity, trust, and leadership, come together to form some form of assessment as the extent to which countries can cope. And can I just add a sort of a further fourth element, perhaps even a lens, which has to do not so much with those formal questions that we're very familiar with, but really another one which has to do with how do we think about countries being able to protect their people, if that's the right term. We think of public health as being about protection primarily, but those who have to navigate modern markets and public services in India, Australia, and Indonesia sometimes are let down by those markets and public services They look to states to try to protect them or at least shield them from the worst effects of dealing with everyday reality in those societies. And in some respects, COVID-19 has sort of stretched that challenge. People are in that sense looking for protection, not just from the health consequences of the virus itself, but protection from having to navigate a precarious position in the economy, their daily lives in terms of family relationships. They may even, in some respects, need to be saved from their fellow citizens whose actions they cannot directly influence. In other words, there is an opportunity here to comment upon paternalism, whether states have to step in or can step in and have the capacity to do so in this modern age. I'm not going to leave it carry on any longer. I'm going to hand over to Steve Smith at this stage and look forward to the discussion in the course of the next hour and a half. Steve.
Well, Sharmat, thanks very much for that scene setter, and Gordon, thank you very much for wearing your direct CEO of the Perth USAsia Centre, jointly hosting this event with the UWA Public Policy Institute. And we've got a terrific panel this afternoon or this evening or this morning, wherever you are tuning in from. It's a panel which would hold its head up high in any global panel considering these matters. Firstly, we have Dewi Fortuna, who is a distinguished academic, former government official and contributor to Indonesia. Has previously worked at high level in Indonesian governments with vice presidents and presidents, and is associated with Australian universities and is a long-standing and good friend of Australia. So we're very pleased to welcome Dewi Fortuna Anwar to the panel this afternoon. Secondly, we have Shivshankar Menon. Shivshankar is a highly regarded and distinguished contributor to Indian government and policy affairs. And when I was in office, I had the great pleasure of working closely with Shivshankar in his capacity as the National Security Advisor, which in India is a deeply significant position. And Shivshankar has continued his writings and his contributions to Indian and global affairs. And finally, Marty Natalegawa, former Foreign Minister of Indonesia. Again, I had the great pleasure of serving with Marty. Marty has made substantial contributions to Indonesian policy and political affairs, but has also made significant contributions to the United Nations, both as Indonesia's ambassador, but also his writings and his public contributions have featured public policy, United Nations, multilateralism, and great depth of study on ASEAN. So a very distinguished panel this afternoon. I'm going to do the easy bit, which is to kick off and then ask our panelists in the order in which I've introduced them, just some general questions about how their individual countries have coped with COVID, what have been potentially some strengths and weaknesses, and what implications, most of them adverse, as they have been in Australia, has COVID seen for their countries. Because Dewi is hitting off in first instance for Indonesia, I'll get Marty to make some comments about Indonesia, but also about the region in particular, Indonesia's ASEAN colleagues. So far as Australia is concerned, and we're doing this event physically from Perth, and one of the advantages of Perth is that we're the most isolated capital city in Australian terms. Sometimes we're referred to as the most isolated capital city in the world. That, of course, belies our closeness to Singapore, to Jakarta, and the fact that we're 2.5 hours closer to Delhi than any of our major eastern states, cities, whether it's our capital, Canberra, or Melbourne, or Sydney, our population centres. But Australia being an island country and an island continent, small population, 25 million people, generally with a spread and diverse accommodation arrangements in terms of housing. We don't have the tightness and the closeness of proximity that we find in so many of our large cities in larger population countries, whether that's Indonesia, India, or indeed the United States and Europe. So we've had some considerable advantages in seeking to grapple with COVID and its adverse consequences. We've been able to isolate our borders, both national and state, and we've been able to take advantage of our climate and our continuing Australian outdoor environment to miss the worst of the bullets that COVID has fired. Having said that, those implications and those decisions have had serious adverse consequences, both in the short and in the long term for our economy, where governments and officials have had to make difficult decisions about health, public health, but also ongoing economic activity. And as you all would have seen and be aware of, in recent weeks, we've also seen significant deleterious outcomes so far as the numbers of cases in Melbourne and Victoria is concerned, and that's seen a sharp lockdown of Melbourne and Victoria and consequent lockdowns of borders adjoining Victoria. So whilst we've had those advantages, there has still been considerable adverse consequences as a result of trying to keep the pandemic under control. Those advantages, some of those advantages are not necessarily shared by either Indonesia or by India. Much larger populations, in Indonesia's case, thousands of islands spread over a diverse archipelago. In India's case, sharing land borders with other countries and significantly high population centres. So whilst in Australian terms we regard ourselves as lucky, it's still come at an economic and a social cost. Now, to see how respective governments and countries have dealt with those similar issues in different circumstances, if I could start, Dewi, with you, just your own thoughts as to how Indonesia has grappled with the difficulties, how the central government, the Jokowi administration, and also the provincial governments have tried to deal with COVID, and what adverse consequences you see as a result of the pandemic pressing itself upon Indonesia's social and economic affairs. So, Dewi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Hello, everyone. It's 3:13 in Jakarta. So, in one short sentence, I would say that the Indonesian management of COVID, if it is one word, it's muddling through. At the moment, as of yesterday, the people who are infected have continued to increase. At the moment, total infection has reached 116,871, and with deaths at over 5,000, and suspected of 94,000. And it's not yet reached peak. People in other countries talk about second wave, and Indonesia, in fact, we haven't even finished the first wave, and the numbers fluctuate, so we don't really know, when the peak will be reached. And as most of you are familiar, that Indonesia was a bit slow in responding to COVID. There was a bit of a denial in the beginning, so there was probably a loss of opportunities for about 5 to 6 weeks when COVID spread to all 34 provinces. So there was a delay in closing the borders. And the government policy in dealing with these public health issues, we can call it a moderate approach, a middle of the road approach. So not allowing laissez-faire like Sweden, just hoping for herd immunity, because that would really could probably kill thousands and thousands of people. But at the same time, avoiding a very stringent lockdown because of the concern that the government will not be in a position to give the social economic support for those who are vulnerable. So what the Indonesian government has done is to introduce what is called large-scale social restrictions, or PSBB, in Indonesia. And even then, it is not really imposed throughout the country. So there is a guideline issued by the Ministry of Health about how the regions can apply for endorsement from the ministry to apply these large-scale social restrictions. They have to provide evidence that COVID has already spread locally in large numbers. They have to show that they have the capacity to provide the necessary social economic support for those who would be affected if businesses are closed down, for example. So despite the fact that over 400 regencies and municipalities out of about more than 500 regencies, municipalities have already been affected by COVID, there have only been 4 provinces that have applied these large-scale social restrictions. Within that 4 provinces, there are 58 regencies. And outside of the 4 provinces, there are 27 other regencies. Many other regencies do not bother to apply. And some regencies that asked for endorsement have failed because they could not provide the necessary support. So large parts of India, in fact, have not implemented physical distancing at all. Now, in the areas where large-scale social restrictions have been applied, there have been serious weaknesses. You know, the partial lockdown, the offices, markets, public spaces, places of worship are supposed to be closed down, but it also at the same time, basic necessities also have to remain open. So some workplaces still operate, but with a reduced number of workers. There's in a lot of government offices and private sectors is work from home. And when schools are closed, of course, learning from home. But there are problems, you know. You can see that, and this leads to later on to the issues of public policies, of inconsistencies. By imposing this, this great hesitancy in applying this large-scale social restrictions, you can see that the government tries to balance the 3 objectives. First, containing the COVID and looking after those who have been infected. So providing public health facilities and protection. But at the same time, there's also this need to provide social safety net for those who are already vulnerable and those who are newly poor, because up to 6 million people have lost their jobs, according to the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. Though data is being debated because the government's data is much lower than that. At the same time, the government also wants to ensure that the economy does not come to a complete standstill, because Indonesia is still a developing country. But there are real weaknesses in this implementations of large-scale social restrictions. It's not been effective. The numbers of people who have been infected and the number of deaths continue to rise. There have been inconsistent policies because you have Indonesia. It's a unitary state, but we also have very fundamental and wide-ranging decentralization. So the responsibility for applying this policy is really at the local government level. And in certain cases, you can see that the local governments are quite keen to protect their regions, but then the national government is much more worried about the bottom line, about the disruption of the economic activity. So sometimes there are contradictory policies in terms of public transports, for example. So when Jakarta, the Jakarta governor said, public transports should be closed down, that this motor vehicles, Gojek, should not carry passengers, but then the Ministry of Transportation issued a different regulation. There's also poor communication. There's a lot of confusions and unclear messaging. The leader of the whole efforts to contain COVID should be the Ministry of Health. But unfortunately, the Ministry of Health has been a real weakness in the whole process. The Minister of Health has been mostly invisible during this period. So inconsistent policies, poor communications, and lack of active enforcement, very lax. When people not comply with a health protocol like wearing masks, on the road, they'll be asked to do a bit of push-up and things like that. So there's not really serious large-scale non-compliance because of general lack of awareness. Public survey showed that a lot of people in Indonesia believe in conspiracy theories about COVID, and then because some officials and entertainment personalities, which do not pay serious attention to COVID, there's a real general lack of awareness and lack of sense of urgency. But it's also due to social and religious practices. It's very difficult. Indonesians, you have deaths and festivals and so on, and there's belief that a lot of people still want to do the Friday prayer, despite the fact that the religious ministry said that you do not do it, because some people continue to believe that they have males, adult males need to go to Friday prayers, for example, and burials. There have been cases of families kidnapping corpses who have been released for COVID burial, and because they believe that they should not be, they want to handle the corpse according to their own more strict religious practices. And then, of course, the most important thing is economic pressure. The large majority of Indonesians' economy is in the hand of the informal sector. They do not have the luxury of big saving. So for them, either to die of COVID or to die of starvation, you can see a lot of cases where policemen are fighting with women in traditional markets because they insisted, the ladies insist on continuing their business. So these are some serious issues. But not positive development. Things could have been worse. I'm not saying that things could be much better if there's a strict enforcement of the COVID protocol. But things would have been worse without the creation of this task force on COVID-19, chaired by the head of the National Agency of Natural Disaster. As you know, Indonesia already has this agency since the tsunami, so it has been quite exemplar. The military has also played a very positive role. They have played a very positive role in supporting this public health issue, evacuating, for example, Indonesian nationals from Wuhan in military transport, providing hospitals and emergency clinics, and so on. And then the regional governments, there have been some best practices as well. Sometimes, the national government has come under a lot of criticisms and in fact scorn in certain cases. But some regional governments and regional leaders have shown up to be quite good in public communication and also having effective policy. And in terms of social capital, Indonesian society is known to be quite strong, and Indonesia actually ranks quite the top in terms of generosity, charity. So in the beginning, when we didn't have sufficient personal protective equipment, there's mobilizations of fund and many people, cottage industries producing this PPE and mobilizing money and also providing assistance to those vulnerable. There are also attempts to cut bureaucracy. Usually red tapes in Indonesia is a classic, but in efforts to combat COVID, in providing more tests and providing PPE and working together on vaccine, for example, a lot of red tapes have been cut to enable this public-private and academic partnership. It is also, in terms of governance reform, this acceleration of e-government, the use of digital bureaucracy, which actually can cut down, can enhance transparency and can cut down on corruption. And also, while the economy as a whole has really suffered, there is one spot which is very bright, which is the growth of e-commerce. But as you know, there are many, many challenges. In the second quarter, the result has just come out that Indonesia's economy has contracted, minus 5.2%. And the government is now desperate to prevent a recession, because if the third quarter continues to be, when the economy continues to contract, Indonesia will go into recession, and this will be as bad as during the crisis. And poverty is an issue. Indonesia has worked very hard to reduce its poverty, but now we have an increase in poverty levels. But data is a major issue. Because when you have newly unemployed people who have not been in the people who have been registered, who are eligible for social assistance, data, the accuracy of the data has been questioned. And because immediately you need to provide social assistance, but there's been cases of people who need it do not get it, and people who don't need it get assistance. And there's a real serious problems of lack of digital infrastructure. When you're talking about home learning, for those who are living in urban areas, middle class children with good infrastructure, then they can do this. But what about those who are living in rural area, who are living, in the mountainous areas in Papua or in the eastern part of Indonesia, or the poorer people, even in Java and in Sumatra? They do not have access to this kind of digital technology. So there is a real concern of, because of this COVID, we are going to lose a generation. There's a gap, a digital gap, and those who are poor, who are not able to continue their lessons during this difficult period, are going to be increasingly left behind as well. Recently, on the 20th of July, the government changed its policy from focusing on managing COVID while economic development is a separate issue. Now the government issued this policy of trying to synergize this by creating a new committee. It's called COVID-19, the National Committee for COVID-19 Management and Economic Recovery. But clearly, this is the driver is in the economic sector, because this is under the coordination of the Coordinating Minister for Economic Affairs, and the daily management is under Minister for State-Owned Enterprises. So the focus is very much on averting recession and increasing domestic consumption, increasing trust, but at the same time, the numbers of people who are infected because of relaxations of the large scale social restrictions. Some offices have been opened again. So now, according to latest figures, 701 new clusters for COVID, most of them in Jakarta, and a number of them in government ministries, including the Ministry of Finance. So this is a real catch-22 situation for Indonesia. They need to boost the economy, so economic activity need to be restored, but at the same time, serious problems of infections again. So the government yesterday, on the 4th of August, the president has issued a new presidential instruction about asking for regional governments to enforce this COVID protocol, health protocol, more seriously with fines, and so on, so that people will be much more compliant. And budgets are being allocated, to address the 3 areas of public health, social support, and also for the economic recovery program. So I think I should stop here for the moment. I've taken more than 10 minutes. Thank you, Steve.
Well, Dewi, thank you very much for that comprehensive analysis of how Indonesia has sought to grapple with this very difficult pandemic. And already, even though Australia and Indonesia are very much different countries, some familiar themes coming through. Firstly, the difficulties of getting perfect coordination between Commonwealth and state, or national and state administrations. In Indonesia's case, the central government and provincial governments. The agonising that governments necessarily go through in terms of, are we seeking here to avert a pandemic, but at the same time we don't want to wreak economic ruin upon our country. The digital divide, which also occurs in Australia, where if you have the benefit of digital capacity like we do for this particular event, then you can make do, you can even do better than making do. But if you don't have that same digital capacity, then you are doubly disadvantaged. And finally, whilst there is a lot to point to, which is on the bad news side, in Australia's case, we're already in recession. The drop in GDP is greater than the global financial crisis, largest unemployment that we've seen since the Great depression in the 1930s. There are some areas of economic activity which have flourished in the digital environment. So whilst completely different circumstances, some familiar resonating themes. Now, Shivshankar, of all of the countries, India's problems are probably the highest hurdle to challenge. So a country of 1.4 billion people, culturally diverse, religiously diverse, spread across a large landmass from the south to the north, and land borders with a range of countries, and an economy which very large parts of it don't lend themselves to social distancing as other economies might. So this has been a great challenge from India as we've looked from afar, but how have you seen it on the ground? And what's your perspective of how India and its various governments have sought to grapple with the pandemic?
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thanks for having me. You know, much of what Dewi was saying is also true of India, especially, and you mentioned that too, I think the fact that it's a very large country where conditions vary considerably from place to place. So if you ask me, overall, our experience of dealing with COVID has been very mixed and has evolved over time. India was one of the first actually to impose a severe lockdown and a very strict lockdown all across the country on March 24th, and then to extend it twice after that. And I think that did help considerably to avert considerable spread. But what it could not do is to prevent a very rapid rise in cases in some of the metros, in some of the cities, whereas, you know, social distancing and so on is not possible. And there were initial missteps because I don't think people had taken into account the effects of a sudden lockdown and a cessation of economic activity on casual labor in the cities. Because much of the Indian economy, employment in the Indian economy is actually informal. It's not in the formal sector at all. And so we saw the spectacle of people trying to walk home to their villages when there was no transport and so on. That was fixed subsequently. But despite that, if you look at it over the country, there have been some wonderful cases. I mean, Kerala, for instance, handled it very well, largely through social mobilization. And exactly the point that I think Shamit said about social trust between government, social organizations. There were wonderful instances of volunteerism across the country when we saw migrant labor walking home over hundreds of kilometers. Basically, they were fed by other people who chose to do this out of the goodness of their hearts and organize this. But the experience was very patchy. Today, if you look at overall India, yesterday, there was something like 1.9 million total cases. And about 1.2 million of those have since recovered. But most of these are concentrated in about 4 states. In Tamil Nadu, in Maharashtra, and in places where there are very high urban concentrations. The good news, of course, is that India has one of the lowest fatality rates in the world. In fact, it's quite remarkable. And we have no explanation for it except to say that we have a very young population. So maybe people who got it were able to overcome it. But that's not sufficient explanation. The case fatality ratio is less than 2. So it's really, it's amazing whereas in Europe and so on, it's in 8, 9, some places even higher. And this is on a relatively low by Indian standards, 21 million tests. So what we're now seeing is not so much a second wave as a success in 2 or 3 of the metros. In Delhi, for instance, the number of recoveries every day is now more than the fresh cases. So it looks like it might be under control. Bombay is approaching that, hasn't got there yet. But in Tamil Nadu, in Chennai, it's still pretty rampant. But what does it tell us? What is the effect of it on us? I think COVID hit India when the Indian economy, again, by Indian standards, was already slowing. Growth was down to about 4%. Many other people might be happy with that. Indians are unhappy. We've got used to a rich diet over the last 2 decades. And what it's done, therefore, is to actually stress, to actually exacerbate the various divergences which already exist in the economy. You mentioned poverty. You know, in the first decade of this century, something like 141 million people were pulled out of poverty, lifted out of poverty. But they are now at risk, actually, of slipping back because inequality of opportunity and of their incomes actually means that the poor, the weak are actually much more vulnerable now if they lose jobs, if they lose their income stream. So that's one consequence that I think government has had to step in. And that's the second consequence, which I think lesson that we can draw, which is really the role of the state here is much more than, say, traditional market economics would dictate, because this is a case where the market cannot cope with this level of disruption all at once. Interestingly, when you look at the the figures for the second quarter, which are in the process of coming out, the rural economy has done very well, has kept growing right through the second quarter, through the lockdown and everything. The urban economy, the organized sector of the economy, manufacturing certainly has suffered. Where we'll end up by the end of the year, we're not really sure. The estimates range from anywhere from 1.2% growth over the year to minus 12%, depending on which economist you ask. The government's reaction, and actually a popular reaction to this, has been to say that we need to be much more self-reliant, much less dependent on global supply chains. That's frankly a discussion which nobody's quite sure how far we can take this. After all, we've tried an autarkic import substitution kind of policy in the 50s and 60s, and it didn't work. I mean, it worked, but worked very slowly. Today, almost half India's GDP is the external sector, if you add remittances and so on. So there's no way that India can actually disengage from the rest of the world. But there is a debate going on about how to engage in this new world that we're going to see post-COVID. It has had some immediate consequences. Of course, the digital economy has done very well. Digital firms which rely on cyberspace, they've done very well. Education has had to go online, and this again only exacerbates the divergence between those who can afford to be online, who have connectivity, and those who don't, which is something that we need to address very quickly, this digital divide within ourselves. We are now, from today actually, from yesterday, in what we call Unlock 3.0. Because for the last 2 months, I think the government has shifted the priority back to getting the economy going. Government sees green shoots of recovery, but it's still very hard to say where this goes. So what lessons would I draw from this? It seems to me that just as COVID has done generally to the world, what COVID did to India was to accelerate social, political, economic changes that were already underway, and has made it more necessary that we accelerate the pace of reform, whether it is in the economy, in making ourselves more competitive, in bringing equity back into society, which maybe in the pursuit of rapid growth we had not ignored, but stepped aside from for a while. And I think it's reminded us that the social welfare functions of the state are something that we cannot ignore, that we need to strengthen, and that we need to bring that back front and center. That's a readjustment which, is still not certain, but I think everybody agrees. We need to invest much more in education and health than we have before. Government has already announced plans to do so. The devil, as usual, is in the implementation and the detail, and we'll have to see where we go, because we and the world are really still in the middle of a crisis. I think the problem for all of us is that it's also changed the global environment within which we operate, and that has become much harsher as a result of COVID. Again, but maybe we'll come to that later. I'll stop there because that's my 7 minutes. Thank you, Steve.
Well, Shivshankar, thank you very much for that. And again, Australia, India, entirely different countries in terms of context and makeup, but again, some striking similarities. In Australia, as the economic downturn has occurred, the packages put in place by the government worked well, some would say very well, for those people who were in full-time, long-established employment, what we call job seeker or job keeper. But for those people who were in casual employment or who were in part-time employment with a range of employers, didn't fit the mould. And so our most significant argument about state support for people who've been displaced as a result of the pandemic has featured casual employment, part-time employment, temporary employment. And all of those things have risen in Australian economy as a result of globalisation and economic competition amongst states. And so there's been a similar thinking here about, well, is there something that we need to do down the track which is different from why we went down the role of casual and more efficient employees than permanent employees. So again, those same sorts of social and economic issues coming up in vastly different countries, but in the same context. So Marty, Dewi gave a comprehensive sort of outline of what's occurring in Indonesia, but by all means, make your own remarks about Indonesia if you so choose. But given your regional interests and your keen interest in ASEAN, how has not just Indonesia but the region been responding? And as we've seen in Australia, Indonesia and India, there are different responses in different cities and parts of the country, let alone different nations. So what's your Indonesian and then regional perspective?
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. Delighted always to be in such a forum with friends, and thank you for making possible today's discussion. When one reflects on the question of impacts of COVID on India, Indonesia, and Australia, actually one wonders whether it is actually possible to have like a snapshot of where we are today, given the situation is constantly evolving, constantly changing. So in a way, lessons are not yet fully learned. We are actually learning as we proceed in this ongoing pandemic. The quality that I wanted to emphasize, if I may, Stephen, is that we are dealing with ramifications and impacts that are multifaceted, isn't it? I mean, it's multifaceted, they are interrelated, and they are constantly changing and evolving. As a result, therefore, whenever we look and reflect on how governments have done or countries have performed, we are really looking at like a moving target and constantly re-evaluating our own evaluation of how things are. And I think we have to have that kind of adaptive mindset when we look at things, rather than imagining that we can have like a snapshot of how things are and then assume this is where we are and how we should be moving forward. In other words, in my view, Stephen, whether we are talking at the local, national, regional, or global level, the best that we can do is simply identify the dynamics. What are the key dynamics, the key common questions that governments in India, in Australia, in Indonesia, and elsewhere are facing, and what extent we can be sharing lessons learned and experience as we are wrestling with those challenges. In this regard, Stephen, at the real risk of oversimplification, when one think of the impact of COVID thus far, there's a number of facets or a number of dimensions that comes to the fore. One is what others have spoken earlier far more eloquently than I could possibly do, in terms of the nexus or the impact of COVID on the economy, whether it be the national economy, the regional and the global economy. I think this is the most obvious and most manifest challenge. How one synergize or balance the apparently contending demands for public health and economic recovery. In a way, this is not totally surprising. This is the nexus that is most highlighted because economic indices are relatively quantifiable. It's readily available, and one can see a before and after, and hence we tend to gravitate towards this particular dimension of the impact of COVID. And of course, naturally, governments places priority on this facet. But having said that, the economic dimension or economic nexus vis-a-vis COVID is only one facet. We are all no doubt familiar with the nexus or the convergence between the COVID issues and geopolitics, whether, it's not without accident in my view that the 6 or 8 months since we have had this pandemic, we are seeing as well renewed tensions, renewed geopolitical tensions between key countries in the world, key countries in the region, where geopolitical tensions have sharpened. Rather than seeing more partnership, we are seeing more competition between so-called major powers. So that is another facet that is worthy of reflection. And not least of all, Stephen, I think how the COVID and pandemic relates to the question of international order and multilateralism. If ever there was a moment where, this is like a case where multilateralism should shine, should come to the fore, this is it. Because the COVID-19 and pandemic is a reminder of issues that define national solutions, issues that requires partnership and cooperation. But on the contrary, we are seeing multilateralism at the risk of oversimplification, weaken. We are seeing the WHO being weakened the way it has. The United Nations Security Council largely ineffective in endorsing the Secretary General's call for ceasefire throughout different parts of the world. That's another facet worthy to ponder and to reflect. And of course, not least of all, the governance facet as well. How the response to COVID, inform us on how one relates to the question of response to democracy, to human rights, and other similar concerns. In that regard, I wish not to add to what Ibu Dewi has said, because she has been extremely eloquent and comprehensive, and yet succinct at the same time in describing the major developments in Indonesia. But simply to highlight, in my view, again, not wanting to go into numbers, not wanting to describe things, but simply to identify certain dynamics, I think that's worthy of reflection and worthy of further attention in the future. One is the one that I have mentioned before, how Indonesia and countries like Indonesia deal with this nexus between the economy and public health. I'm rather despondent and rather unhappy when the suggestion is being made that it is an either-or proposition. It's either you address the public health issue and at the risk of the economy, grinding to a halt, or you go for the economy and then the public health issue will probably become worsened. But surely nowadays there must be a more cogent, a more a more smarter way of dealing with these matters in a synergic manner. Health for the economy, because one can't imagine a sustained economic recovery if the inherent health crisis is not being resolved, because there will be a trust deficit issue, etc. But somehow we need to get this synergy right in terms of the economy and public health. I think that's one indices or one nexus that must be under our watch, especially given what others have said, the impact of the economic downturn on the issue of inequity in worsening the conditions of the most vulnerable in our society. I think that is one point well worth underscoring. The other nexus, the other dynamic I wanted to highlight is the governance issue. Has the government or the authorities, in responding to the COVID challenge, have they placed science at the forefront? Is it a science-led effort, or is there some other motivation, some other dynamics that is being injected, whether it be political, whether it be economic? And here I think the local, national, regional dynamic becomes extremely important, because everything has a political context and political dimension to it. Some economies, I'm not talking about Indonesia here specifically, but some places prominence to the civilian-led, science-led efforts. Others place greater emphasis on a more enforcement type of approaches. I think this is one well worth underscoring, because in my view, if ever there was a time when democratically elected politicians should defer to science, this would be it, wouldn't it? I mean, we have to have the capacity to listen to those who knows what they're talking about. And I think this is one other indices that needs to be looked at. And the other is how the country deal with crisis. I mean, Dewi had mentioned before, whether we lost some critical moments in terms of the initial questions or question marks or questioning whether this is a real threat to Indonesia or not. But that's behind us. What's important is that we focus on the current and the present. But just my final cluster of thoughts, Stephen, conscious of the limitation of time, is on the regional context. Region meaning Southeast Asia or Indo-Pacific. I think Southeast Asia have been quite positive in contrast to other sub-regions in terms of the cases of COVID. I think the governments, whether it be because of their own national efforts or because of ASEAN-wide efforts, in contrast to other sub-regions, we have thus far managed the pandemic in a better way than some other sub-regions. And ASEAN certainly cannot be accused of being inactive in terms of summit diplomacy is concerned, because there's been a proliferation of ASEAN summits in web form, obviously, with their key partners, with Australia included, with other dialogue partners. If there is one footnote that I wish ASEAN had done, unless I'm mistaken, and they have done it, is that they could have convened an East Asia summit response rather than sectoral ASEAN Australia, ASEAN China, ASEAN US, because the key missing link today is US China. And if there is one advantage of the East Asia summit format, is that at least those two countries are under one tent. And we've been having a separate process with all our dialogue partners, and at best it was only with ASEAN +3. I know that at the official level there was an East Asia Summit conversation, but this is where leadership matters, and it would have been quite powerful if early on ASEAN had convened an East Asia Summit at the leaders level and have leaders of China and leaders of the United States in one setting. But the fact that ASEAN have been active, at least in terms of convening meetings, is not without importance. A commitment to share information, commitment to coordinate their policy response, to draw lessons learned, I think is extremely important. especially given the fact that the impact of COVID in terms of cases are quite disparate. I mean, you have cases like Indonesia and the Philippines into the hundreds of thousands, 100,000 or so, and others like Laos with only like 20 cases, confirmed cases. So given the disparity of impact, the fact that the ASEAN 10 can work the way that they have, I think it speaks well to their cooperation efforts. And my final point, Stephen, is that I think ultimately this COVID pandemic reminds us that we need to have, whether it be global, whether it be regional, governance that's fit for the 21st century. We have nowadays problems that are transnational in nature, transboundary in nature, defies geographical national delimitation, and yet our responses in the final analysis is essentially national. I mean, I spoke of ASEAN's efforts, meetings and summits that they have convened, but when all is said and done, I wonder to what extent those regional level declarations transmit to national level decisions, or whether they become like a separate in their own world type of setting. In other words, we need to think of a more relevant, a more human security type of consideration, rather than traditional national security type of approach. I'm sorry if I've taken up more than I should have, but those are some of my thoughts at the moment, Stephen. Thanks.
Well, Marty, thank you very much for that. I think a couple of, again, familiar themes that we've seen from Dewi and Shivshankar. I think your use of the phrase dynamism is a very good one, because as we've experienced in Australia and also we've seen in India and Indonesia, this can be a very fast-moving matter or event. So, 6 weeks ago, we thought we had it under control. Now we've got what we regard as a crisis in Victoria, which is a quarter of our economy. So the need for governments to be dynamic and for communities to be dynamic and respond quickly is a challenge. And one thing we've learned from both our own experience and the European experience is that if you think that the virus is getting anywhere near active, then you need to act and act quickly, because otherwise the consequences of not acting for the economy are even worse than the consequences you take when you make those early moves. So there are issues of dynamism. You echoed, I think, a point that Shivshankar made, which is things which were occurring anyway have now been accelerated by the COVID circumstance, and deteriorating relationships between US and China was one of the matters you referred to. I think it's a deeply significant point you've made about if ever there was a crisis which lent itself to more improved and greater regional and global cooperation, whether that's through the East Asia Summit or through the UN and its agencies, and this is a classic illustration, but maybe COVID is just accelerating a perception of what has been occurring over a longer period of time, decades perhaps. There are a range of issues that I want to follow up, but I just want to start with what you see as the longer term economic and social consequences of COVID to Indonesia and India. And so one of the reasons that it makes sense these days to talk about the East Asia Summit, as Marty has done, is because all of the key players are in the room at the same time: India, Indonesia, China, US, Japan, Australia, and all of the ASEAN 10. And one of the reasons East Asia Summit made sense was because of the rise of Indonesia and the rise of India as great economies and great global influences. And so by the midpoint of this century, all of the respectable pre-COVID estimates and analyses were that by 2050, India would be in the top 2 economies, Indonesia in the top 4 economies. And this has been one of the driving developments for looking now at the world as a more multipolar world, and looking at the Indo-Pacific, where India, Indonesia, Japan, Australia have got significant roles to play in addition to the G2, US and China. So what longer term implications are there? Is there any adverse impact in the long term for India's growth, economy rise, for Indonesia's longer term economic prospects? And also, what are some, are there any long term social adverse consequences of COVID? Let's start with the economy, because with economic strength comes strategic prowess, military prowess, and geopolitical prowess. So, longer-term economics, Dewi, what's the prognosis for Indonesia's long-term economic growth?
Well, this is with disclaimer, not being an economist. So, I'm only going to look at it from a political economic perspective. As you know, Indonesia is not as well integrated into the global economy in terms of international trade and investment compared to many of our neighbors. So there is concerns that one of the weaknesses of Indonesia in terms of competitiveness is in its poor infrastructure. So President Joko Widodo has put infrastructure development as a priority. And for that, Indonesia has been trying to attract foreign investment, building ports, toll roads, trains, and, for connectivity, it's very important, including maritime connectivity. And one of the immediate impact of COVID is, of course, that has stopped because work has stopped, and maybe investment in these areas have also stopped. Resources are being, countries that are investing outside are focusing internally for also to look after the economy. So that probably the timetable, of Indonesia's infrastructure has been put slightly backward. Then for the second term of Jokowi's term, because for the first term, he's put form a lot of emphasis on physical infrastructure. And as I say, that has suffered a reverse because of this COVID-19. For his second term, he's put an emphasis on human resource development. And clearly, COVID has really put that in a disarray because schools are being closed down, and we have children and students are being forced into online learning, where the availability of the supportive infrastructure is not even. So you can imagine that, the human resources development, there might be, if this problem goes on, if home learning, if schools continue to be closed down for months to come, children who are supposed to be reaping from this, demographic bonus, will have lost about, that is at a very critical age, the teenage years during the secondary schools, and going to just starting university. Maybe those who are already at university maybe can do that. And those who are in primary school, just junior high school, secondary school, when they're just learning their arithmetics, reading, comprehension, they're going to be left behind. And the issues of public health. Indonesia has this very ambitious national health insurance system, and even then, the government is already suffering from huge deficit pre-COVID. So you can imagine the stress on the central government budget and regional government budgets on financing this health issue. So I'm sure that all the efforts at the moment, it is trying to recover. We're not talking about growth yet. So I think we need to it's very consequential because in terms both of the physical infrastructure and the soft infrastructure of the Indonesian economy are suffering serious setbacks.
Thanks, Dewi. I think a really significant point you've made there is one of the reasons the vast bulk of longer term economic projections point to Indonesia and India's longer term economic growth and being in the top four is a demographic advantage, a much younger population. Your point is if part of that younger population misses out on the advantage of education and skills, then that will have a negative impact on the economy in the long term. But Shivshankar, you spoke in terms of India becoming used to a sort of a 6% plus growth economy, that India itself was not welcoming the 4% growth that we saw, which was off the back of GST implementation and also the cash economy changes. So what's your view about the longer term? Is India still on trajectory to be a great economy and a great power in the coming decades?
You know, I'm very nervous of all these estimates. I always have been. Because there's just so many variables. Anything beyond 5 to 10 years, I think, is very hard to tell. In terms of relative position, the whole world has lost a year, economically speaking. We have a lost year here. And the whole world actually has been diminished, both politically and economically. Every power has suffered from what's happened. So, relatively speaking, I don't think India has done worse or much better than, say, the global average. So in terms of, is India still on that trajectory? That trajectory might have slowed because the global economy has slowed. We are part of the global economy, but like Indonesia, we are not a big part of global value chains or global supply chains, have not been integrated the way some of our other neighbors have been, especially countries in Southeast Asia. And we are going through a process of re-examining how to engage, having left the RCEP negotiations at the last minute, something that I personally think maybe we shouldn't have, but for whatever reasons, I mean, now that we've done that, and that's part of a general re-examination of how India needs to engage with the world. I'd be very nervous at predicting where we will be 3 years from now, 5 years from now. What we are seeing, unfortunately, so far, whether it's the US, China, the two biggest economies in the world, they are now behaving like the FANG, like the big four tech companies have behaved for many years, which is not to use capital efficiently. I mean, they haven't bothered about making profits for years, but to establish market dominance. Now, that's a mercantilist approach. If the rest of us all start behaving like that, and if the two biggest economies in the world keep behaving like that, frankly, the world economy is in real trouble. And that's what worries me about the effects of COVID. If COVID changes the way we behave to the extent that we all turn not just protectionist in the traditional way, but mercantilist in this sense of seeking economic domination, rather than trying a situation where, the all boats rise when the tide rises, then I think we're really in trouble. Then all bets are off. And this is one reason why I'm so nervous of making any forecasts. India is a big enough economy, has sufficient domestic demand, and I think can actually, and has competitive advantages, which I think give it certain strengths, apart from demography and so on. And so I'm fairly confident that we can restore growth. That's not the problem. But in what kind of world will we be operating, and how will this affect our relative position? That I'm much more nervous of saying.
I think that's I think it's a very significant point. In Australia, as you would know, we've been having this conversation, which is, well, COVID has accelerated our analysis that we've become too dependent upon particular supply or value chains. And so we're being forced to look at diversity and effectiveness of supply chains in a whole range of areas. The obvious starting point being personal protection equipment for health purposes. And that's run straight up against our long-standing view of we want to be an open economy and a trading economy. So when does wanting to have reliable and secure supply chains and diverse supply chains, plus have a domestic capability, when does that move from protecting the efficiency of your economy to a default protectionism? I think that's a deeply significant economic question that we're all going to be asking down the track. I want to come back to some of you can respond, please, Shivshankar.
One big beneficiary of all this is going to be India-Australia relations for various reasons, but that's another discussion, I think.
Well, I have said tongue-in-cheek, but I'm serious about it, which is a self-reliant India with Australia's assistance. Works well for us. Ambassador Anil Wadhwa, I think, is registered for this event, who's doing the Indian economic study into Australia. So we'll give Anil food for thought. Marty, any comments on the economic side? But I also, in one of the registered questions, there's a question from Samina Yasmin from University of Western Australia, which goes to, do you see, and I've focused so far on the economy, but do you see any adverse longer-term social cohesion problems arising out of COVID, both for Indonesia and the world? But on the economy first.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I'd like to share some thoughts on your initial question, if I may, please. Essentially, how the changing economic dynamic will impact on the future trajectory and implications on geopolitical issues, etc. Because in a way, this is a concession or admission of the correlation between the economy and politics, in terms, especially geoeconomics and geopolitical developments. And I think the most illustrative evidence or example of that correlation would be the formation of the G20. The G20, of which Australia, India, and Indonesia are members or participants, is a reflection, is it not, of changing economic architecture, changing economic dynamics, and hence the need to reform and to adapt the global architecture, so to speak, to reflect better the changing dynamic, economic trajectory and dynamic. I think that is a clear example of that correlation. But what the G20 also reminds me, actually, is of the resilience of the economies of the Indo-Pacific. Indonesia, a country in 1998 that was beset by multiple crises, economic, financial, political crisis, but within a decade or so was able to recover, its economic resilience demonstrated, and become a key member of the G20 group of countries. In other words, when we speak now of COVID, the impact on the economies of the region, including Indonesia, I still have confidence in the economic resilience of Indonesia and economies such as India and Australia, that when the dust settles, we will be still, at the forefront of the constantly changing economic and geopolitical architecture. Especially nowadays, the impact is more global. It's not only an Asia-Pacific or East Asia Malays problem. It is a common problem. We are all basically equally affected, but I have confidence that our economies in this part of the world will rebound as energetically as others would be, and find ourselves at the forefront of the changing situation. So that is the more traditional response, if I may call it that, in terms of my confidence that ultimately, when the dust settles, the economies of our region, Australia, India, and Indonesia, will find itself still not insignificant to play a major role. But at the same time, if I was to be a little bit more thinking outside the box, I think, Stephen, the COVID-19 reminds us of the changing nature of power in the 21st century. I mean, you can no longer assume that there is a static index of economies or military power from number 1 to number 10 to number whatever it is, the list, and then this is like a permanent index of power of countries' influence. But in my view, in the 21st century, power defined as being capacity to effect change will really depend on the issues concerned. On some issues, some countries are more relevant, more important than others. And there is not like a one-size-fits-all where one country is permanently important on every issue that comes to the fore, but it will really be driven on the nature of the issue concerned. And this is why I think for a country like Indonesia, this economic convulsion, economic crisis that we are facing actually presents an opportunity as well. We have an opportunity now to revive our economy that is more equitable, that is more socially sensitive, and as well as more sustainable in terms of environment. We can develop better the renewable energy. We can develop better this more sustained, environmentally friendly economic recovery, more socially cohesive, socially sensitive economic recovery. As a result, our economy will be more 21st century economy, more relevant, and where we can be around the table where these kind of decisions are, important decisions are being made. But if we recover with the old mindset, with the old type of economy, then I'm afraid, you know, I mean, the macro numbers may suggest that we are powerful, we are significant, but when it's broken down into specific issues, we will find ourselves not really part of the equation and part of the discussion. My last point as well, Stephen, is that within ASEAN itself, I think the COVID, the economic dynamics will be quite, will have interesting implications. Because in ASEAN, it's quite traditional for us to delineate between the ASEAN 5 and the CLMV countries, as if there is two different speed or different type of economic progress developments in ASEAN. But seeing economies such as Vietnam that is now performing the way it is, and some other economies of the CLMV countries that are not as affected by the COVID, I think we are going to see some recalibration of the influence, I mean, power dynamics within ASEAN as well.
Thanks, thanks, Marty. And can I draw you on very quickly on the social cohesion point? Any dangers you see there?
Well, I mean, Ibu Dewi and has highlighted this point as well. You know, when we speak of the economic downturn, it is the impact have not been equitable, isn't it? I mean, the most vulnerable have been most affected, and increased level of unemployment, poverty, and naturally there will be potential for social tensions and etc. That's why I think the government has been extremely deliberate in wanting to target the economic stimulus package towards those who are most in need. But of course, like in many other countries, there is governance issues in terms of whether the intended objectives have been achieved in the most efficient way because of some administrative issues perhaps. But yes, this is an issue that must be highlighted and recognized. You know, the impact of the health impact, for instance, we are all now focused on COVID, and our health infrastructure are focused on addressing COVID-related challenges. But what of the more traditional, long-standing health issues, the SDG goals that we've all committed ourselves, for instance? There is real risk of regression in those areas, which I think while we deal with COVID, we have to also constantly deal as well with these other issues that cannot be delayed.
All right, it's been a fascinating conversation. We're now starting to run up against time. So I'm going to try and kill two birds with one stone. So Shivshankar spoke about the, I've seen it described as either economic punitive approach of both China and the United States currently, or mercantilist approach as Shivshankar has described it. To what extent do we think, and this is why I'm killing two birds with one stone, one of the questions was, to what extent has COVID just accelerated things that were occurring anyway? So to what extent do we see the economic stances of both China and the United States being accelerated by COVID, being more stark and clear as a result of COVID? And to what extent more generally do we see the changed relationship between the US and China, what I've described on occasions as a Cold War with economic characteristics? But even in recent days and weeks, the strategic and the security and the defence side of that relationship has also sharpened and bristled. So to what extent US-China relations both economic and security, do we see COVID as having shone a light on or accelerated, or are they as a result of different events which would have occurred anyway? So Dewi, we'll start with you. Okay,
I think it's just as Pak Marty and also Ambassador Menon said, this is the geopolitical rivalry, the rivalry between US and China has been there. So, the trade war has already started long before COVID. The rivalry in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly in the South China Sea, between China's assertiveness in asserting its claim on the one hand, and the US determination to carry out freedom of navigation on the other, that have been there. And the disputes over technology, about Huawei, for example, it's already pre-COVID. So COVID-19 has sort of worsened it, because now it's gone multilateral over the role of China and WHO, and then the US pulling out, and whether it's COVID-19 or Wuhan virus, that kind of thing. So it's just worsened the atmosphere, and also the fact that because of the impossibility of travel and meeting, the backroom chat that have taken place, quietly, being facilitated by third parties, for example, have not been able to come, despite the difficulties in US-China relations. Every so often, as you know, that the senior leaders from both countries have usually been talking, whether it's about the South China Sea, or whether about trade. But now, as you mentioned, Stephen, the important meetings have not taken place. So it in a way, COVID has worsened it, has prevented the face-to-face meeting. You cannot solve Zoom, tricky issues by Zoom. You cannot really build trust through webinar. You really need to have face-to-face meeting here.
Thanks, Dewi. Shivshankar?
I agree entirely with Dewi that it's basically worsened China-US relations, which were already on a pretty bad track to begin with. But I do think there's two respects in which COVID has made the situation much worse than it might have been otherwise. One is it induced tremendous domestic stress on the leaderships of both China and the US. And in that situation, for the US leadership, with an election coming, it became almost impossible for them to do the give and take, the bargaining, the compromises that are required for diplomatic solutions or to handle difficult issues. You have a difficult enough relationship to begin with, but I think COVID made it much harder by creating stress internally. And it's not an accident that I think the Chinese are doing a rectification movement in the party now. I mean, that's a pretty extreme step. So for me, both of them are under tremendous domestic stress, and that has made life much harder. Secondly, and this is partly COVID, but partly also what's happened in Hong Kong, what China has done in Hong Kong has really marked the end of one country, two systems, which in a sense makes Taiwan a hot issue again, which it wasn't before. Maybe not Taiwan itself, certainly the other offshore islands. There are islands in the South China Sea, which Taiwan occupies. And that, in that respect, that I don't think was necessarily about to happen if it hadn't been for all the stress that COVID created. So what we have now is a sort of coming together of multiple crises, geopolitical crises, all of which have been worsened by COVID. So I agree with them.
Marty?
Well, Stephen, not surprisingly, I wish to echo Dewi and Shivs as well, the point that they have said that how COVID essentially magnified and accelerated perhaps the already sharp rivalry between the United States and China. It is the known unknowns, which is now becoming glaringly clear that this is a problem that's going to stay with us, and it's becoming increasingly multifaceted. It's no longer traditional security over South China Sea, East China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, but it has become technology, even on apps, on issues, on trade, etc. It's becoming multifaceted the way that others have described. And the point that Shiv's mentioned before as well, I think the domestic dynamic is becoming increasingly coming to the fore. In a way, it reflects the general trend nowadays where foreign policies are becoming domesticated in a most extreme way, where there is less space for compromises, for good old-fashioned diplomacy to take place, because some leaders often have, most of the time, have domestic constituencies to attend to first and foremost, and as a result, we hear, but we don't really listen to one another, and we have the situation that we have. But my question, Stephen, my inclination is, then we are not in a business of admiring the problem. I mean, we know this. We know US-China rivalry is a fact of life. It's becoming sharper, it's becoming deeper, it's becoming more multifaceted. But then what? And this is what concerns me nowadays. There is a deafening silence in the region, as if this is becoming too difficult. It's either, it's either that we keep quiet and hoping that the problem will go away, or we wait our turn when we will be put under pressure to go left, or to turn to Beijing, or to turn to Washington. I think countries of the region, Australia, India, Indonesia, and others, ASEAN, must come with a script. How do we manage this strategic competition? Rather than simply describing and analyzing it. And this is where I think there is a deficit of initiative. ASEAN, extremely, courageously in their Indian Ocean, Indo-Pacific Outlook document, speak of ASEAN playing a so-called honest broker role on geopolitical tensions. Well, they said it, they must deliver. You can't just say it in their document and then when the time comes, go AWOL. This is a time for them to deliver if they mean what they say. And in other words, knowing the problem is there, then what do we do about it? I mean, what do leaders do about it? That's the question, I think.
Well, thanks very much, Marty, for ending on that note. I'm under very strict instructions to not let us go too much over time. But just a couple of comments and a couple of reference to some of our registered questions. Of course, Marty's made a plea for ASEAN to put action where its outlook document was, and he's referred to the East Asia Summit, which I think is a perfect vehicle for trying to deal with these great issues in a regional and multipolar way. A couple of our registered participants have suggested that one thing that Australia, India and Indonesia could do as three countries is to play a more active role together in IORA, to start addressing these issues through IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And because we've started our conversation off the back of the COVID pandemic, Tim Inglis from the University of Western Australia, who deals with health and science issues, has made the suggestion that a good thing for the three of us to be doing would be to, in real time, be sharing health intelligence on what we know about the pandemic. It was a question I would have liked to have delivered to Shivshankar, knowing that he spent a lot of his career sifting through intelligence, but also has made the point that he doesn't regard himself as a health expert. But there are a couple of suggestions which we've had from our participants. And the notion of doing everything we can, it's on the economic side, it does have its perversities that of all of the large economies, the US remains outside of the Trade-Pacific Partnership, and India remains the great economy in our region outside of RCEP, and both of those economic defaults need to be rectified as well. So Ibu Dewi, Shivshankar Menon, Marty Natalegawa, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating conversation. We could spend another hour and a half dealing with some of the issues that we've touched upon and how India, Australia and Indonesia can collaborate further. But I'll lose all my privileges if I don't now hand back to Gordon and Charlotte to make some concluding remarks and to end our session. But thank you to the three of you. As ever, it's a great pleasure working with you and seeing you again. Thank you. Gordon and Charlotte?
Well, my remarks will be exceedingly short, mainly to thank Stephen for doing all the hard work and our three magnificent panelists for sharing their insights. If this event were in person, I would right now be feeling horrible that we could only share it with those who were with us in the room at the time. One of the advantages of this COVID era is, as much as we miss the opportunity to have the three of you here with us in WA, is that we now can take the recording of this and share this more broadly, because it really was a fantastic and insightful conversation that helps us think through the challenge that face Australia, Indonesia, India, and in fact the region more broadly. So on behalf of the Perth USAsia Centre, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you, Stephen, for the yeoman efforts in moderating the discussion. Shamit?
Thank you, Gordon. Can I also echo my gratitude and thanks to the panelists and for Stephen for the eloquent way in which they've debated the issues and, of course, gone through some very complex questions in the very limited amount of time. Very quick thought. It's striking that, of course, none of our commentators mentioned elections. I mean, these are very, very tumultuous times. And one of the reasons we don't mention elections right now is all three countries, of course, don't necessarily have them on the horizon. No national elections are due. That was very much a 2019 story. But if you start to piece together some of the questions that have been debated, it seems to me that we ought to be reconvening in a year from now at least, thinking about not just the long-term consequences of COVID, but how the political landscape and some of these fault lines may be created in terms of shaping electoral choice for the future. So I'll put down a marker for that and invite our advisory board now and mark their calendars if they would be so kind. Once again, thank you very much for your time, your incisive comments, sharing your experience, and now, of course, our ability in this COVID era to share this with a larger audience. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.